During the age of European exploration during the 18th and 19th centuries, a fervor developed among Orientalists and colonialists to discover the fabled City of Gold in the heart of the Dark Continent, a term that Europeans used to describe Africa. Thus, the phrase, from here to Timbuktu, became synonymous with isolation and a struggle to reach the furthest place imaginable. Timbuktu, as the story goes, was named after Timbuktu, Buktu or Tumbuk being the name of or for an old woman that the Tareekh left in charge of their summer retreat. Much of the Western expeditions to Timbuktu ended in tragedy, failure, and death became associated with these ill-conceived adventures. The Western world mythicized Timbuktu. Stories were told of a city full of wealth and mystery. Explorers like René Callier told elaborate and compelling stories of their journeys, keeping their audiences hooked to the turn of every page of their adventures. Before word spread of the reality of Timbuktu, many Europeans thought that the buildings had roofs made of gold. Stories began to arise of a king from the 14th century that was so wealthy, he destroyed economies with inflation upon his travel because of the sheer wealth that he spread. Some Western textbooks on world history will even say that the value of gold dropped for years. Today, we hear those stories of the richest man in history, a righteous Muslim man, a king from Mali, who was called Mansa Musa. Some academics estimate his wealth to be equivalent to well over the hundreds of billions of dollars of the richest men alive today. This has only increased the fascination many people hold for Mansa Musa. However, we need to keep in mind that we do not know the extent of the wealth of people like Qarun, who was mentioned in the Quran. Mansa Musa's wealth is estimable only because we have records of the value of some of the gold that he gave in charity during his Hajj trip. The fascination of the West in particular was to the wealth of this king. As far back as 1375, the Majorcan cartographers Abraham Cresques and his son Yehuda included a painting of Mansa Musa sitting on a golden throne holding a gold nugget in their famous Catalan Atlas, which was commissioned by King Peter IV of Aragon and Catalonia. This picture is often featured in some textbooks and videos on the Empire of Mali. However, was this description accurate or an exaggerated view, as was typically the case, as fantasized by Europeans from stories told exemplifying elaborate wealth? More likely, it's the latter. Ahmad ibn Yahya ibn Fadhlillah al-Umari narrates directly from Abi Uthman Sa'id al-Dukkali, who lived in the village of Nayanne and traveled throughout the kingdom for 35 years, describes the throne of the Sultan of this kingdom. He describes it as being a wide and spacious throne made of ebony that had the tusks of elephants on both sides, with each tusk touching the other. However, he did mention that the Sultan also had a set of weapons made of solid gold. So the question is asked, what is the real story of Mansa Musa? The society that Mansa Musa came to rule over was vast. It was not just a single land or people that came under his rule. Mansa, in their language, was the equivalent of Sultan in the Arabic language. He was Abu Muhammad Musa ibn Abi Bakr ibn Salim al-Takruri. He was also known as King Musa. Sometimes he is referred to as Malik al-Takrur, but as al-Umari pointed out, the Sultan of Mali was not pleased with this title, as Takrur was only one part or just one part of his kingdom. He preferred to be called the ruler of Mali because at that time, Mali comprised of Ghana, Wazafun, Tarnka, Takrur, Singhana, Bambuku, Zarnu Tabana, Bitra, Darmura, Zaga, Kabura, Baraguri, Gao, and others. The kingdom of Mali was the greatest and most powerful kingdom of the Muslims in the Sudan. They were the wealthiest and had the greatest armies and lands. Feared by their enemies, they were not backwards and primitive as some colonial accounts attempted to portray them. Before Mansa Musa became the Sultan of Mali, the former king sent 2 large expeditions to explore the Atlantic Ocean, and this was well before any European exploration began, except for the Viking excursions. Interestingly enough, not all of the people in this kingdom were Muslim. Many were also new to Islam and retained some of the practices of their former religions and cultures out of their ignorance. While the non Muslims would pay the jizya in gold, the harms of their practices weighed heavy on Mansa Musa. Among those disbelievers were a savage pagan people, and they were described as minhum man ya'kul luhum bani Adam. They were described as being people who ate the flesh of humans, cannibals, as ad-Dukkari described them. Also, the practice of sihr or magic was prevalent among some tribes. Some of the kuffar or the disbelievers would hunt elephants without conventional weapons. They would use magic, not trickery, but sihr haqiqi, actual magic. The practice of magic was widespread in some areas, especially in Ghana. The Sultan and his governors would often spend time judging between parties where magic was involved. For instance, a case would be brought before the Sultan where a man went to a magician and used this magician to kill another man. The victim's family would take him to the Sultan to judge between them and bring their proofs to illustrate or to demonstrate or to prove that magic was used. If found guilty, the qisas or the penalty of being killed was applied and the sahir would be executed. The enemies of Islam went to great lengths to fight against the kingdom of Malik. Mansa Musa told Ibn Amir Hajib that these enemies were like the Tatar to the Muslims in the East in terms of their physical appearance and in their abilities on the battlefield. Thus, Mansa Musa was concerned with the rectification of his lands and purifying it from shirk or polytheism. Gold and wealth were not his priorities. He was known for his generosity and how freely he gave wealth away in charity, not to boast his wealth and status. This is because he had a concern for the religion. The people of his kingdom wore turbans like those of the Arabs. They often wore white clothes made of cotton that was grown in their lands. Many dressed similar to the Maghariba, the people from what was called Maghrib al-Arabi. Nonetheless, they had unique customs. When one would greet a dignitary of the Sultan, they would remove their turbans and rub ash on their heads. And if someone sneezed in the gatherings of the Sultan or the kings, he would be beaten harshly for it. No one was excused from that. So if someone had to sneeze, they would cover their face towards the ground and they would sneeze quietly so that no one would know. And if the king sneezed, then the people in the gathering would smack their hands upon their chests. Now, of course, these were not practices sanctioned by Islam, but it's just an illustration of some of the practices that the people engaged in during that time. One of the most detailed descriptions of Mansa Musa comes from the personal narrative given to al-Umari by al-Amir Abul Hassan Ali ibn Amir Hajib, who spent quite a lot of time with Mansa Musa when he stopped in Egypt during his trip to perform Hajj. At that time, Abul Hassan Ali ibn Amir Hajib was the governor of Egypt and al-Qurafa. They became friends during this time, with Mansa Musa telling him much about himself and his lands and even those lands surrounding his people from the people of Sudan. As Islam emerged among them, they adopted the Maliki madhab. From amongst their customs that were detailed was that when someone approaches or bestowed a favor upon the king, they must uncover the front of their head and strike the ground with their right hand like the Tatar. And if he requires more than this service, they would rub between their hands. Ibn Amir Hajib said, I have witnessed this with my own eyes. The Sultan would never, or the Sultans, the rulers, they would never eat in the presence of anyone, regardless of who they may be. Instead, they always ate alone. Furthermore, it was customary in Mansa Musa's kingdom that if someone amongst them raised a beautiful daughter, he would present her to him as a servant, whom he owns without marriage, similar to the ownership of the right-hand possession. Ibn Amir Hajib said, with all of this, Sultan Musa was a religious person who carefully observed all of his prayers, his dhikr or remembrance of Allah, the recitation of the Quran. And Ibn Amir Hajib recounts, he says, I said to him, these type of customs are not permissible for a Muslim, neither by legislation nor by intellect. And he replied, Mansa Musa replied, and not even for kings? Ibn Amir Hajib said to him, not even for the kings. And asked the scholars about this. Mansa Musa replied to him, he swore by Allah, I did not know this. I will abandon this and completely abstain from it in every way. This story demonstrates how seriously Mansa Musa rahimahullah took his religion and how concerned he was for implementing the correct practices in Islam and how receptive he was to correcting certain practices that were not from Islam. Ibn Amir al-Hajib continued to describe him saying, I saw that this Sultan Musa was someone who loved good and good people. He left his kingdom in the hands of his son Muhammad, and he left to go out to set out to perform his obligatory Hajj. He visited the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ and returned to his land and kept his son as the Sultan in his stead while he returned to Mecca until he died. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon him. What we understand from this is that Mansa Musa was not someone who chased wealth and status as some people today will portray him. He was someone who sought knowledge and wanted his people to learn more about the religion of Islam, which is why he spent an incredible amount on Islamic books and schools. Ibn Amir Hajib described Mansa Musa and those who came with him for Hajj as a king and honorable people. They were well dressed and they were pleasant. Mansa Musa was generous and he gave much wealth away in charity. He left his lands with 100 camels fully loaded with gold to give to the tribes and the people on his way to Egypt, and then to give more in charity in Egypt, and to give even more on his way to the Hijaz. He gave so much of his wealth away in charity that he was in need of a loan for his trip back, of which he raised money from some of the merchants to finance his return, and he rewarded them handsomely by giving them 1,000 dinars. Ibn Amir al-Hajib stated that Mansa Musa sent him 500 mithqal of gold as a going away gift. Al-Umari also narrated from people who described the arrival of Sultan Musa to Cairo on his way to Hajj. Among those whom he asked about Mansa Musa's character and piety was the Emir Abu al-Abbas Ahmad ibn Jaki al-Mahmindar, who was sent on behalf of the Sultan al-Malik al-Nasr Muhammad ibn al-Qalawun. The Emir Abu al-Abbas continues to say, he says, Mansa Musa honored me intensely and dealt with me in the best of manners. However, he spoke to me through an interpreter despite his ability to speak Arabic. Then he sent a large quantity of gold to the treasury of the Sultan. I tried to get him to come to the palace and meet with the Sultan, and he refused my request and would not go. He told me, I've come to make Hajj, not for any other purpose, and I do not want to mix my intention for Hajj with anything else. And this was the reasoning he chose to stand by. However, I knew that he saw that his attendance would be a deficiency for his Hajj because he would be forced to kiss the ground and the hand of the Sultan. I kept urging him to go, and he kept refusing and excusing himself. I had a royal obligation to bring him in attendance, so I kept urging him until he agreed. When he presented himself in attendance in front of the Sultan, we said to him, kiss the ground. He stopped and outright refused. He then said, how is this permissible? A reasonable man went to speak with him in private. We don't know what was said. Then he, meaning Mansa Musa, said, I only prostrate to Allah, who has created me and sustained me. Then he prostrated. The Sultan came to him and brought him up standing and then honored him and had him sit beside him where they spoke for a long time. There are other accounts of this incident. Ibn Aybak, ad-Dawadari, simply stated that he kissed the ground but did not mention any opposition he had. Al-Dhahabi and al-Yafi'ee mentioned that he greeted the Sultan, but he did not sit down. They also did not give any reasons or details. Ibn al-Wardi, al-Safadi, Ibn Kathir, and Maqrizi mentioned that he refused to kiss the ground and prostrate, and he did not do so. But then he was barred from sitting down, except that as-Safadi mentioned that he was still forced to comply. Taqiyuddin al-Fasi and Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani both mentioned a similar reason for his refusal. Ibn Hajar stated that he said, I refuse to prostrate to anything besides Allah. And al-Fasi mentioned that he said this and added that he is a Maliki with regards to his madhab. In all of these accounts, it is clear that the Sultan and his court had tried to enforce this prostration while Mansa Musa refused because, as Muslims, we only bow to Allah alone. This shows how strongly he felt about his adherence to Islam. The practice of kissing the ground in front of the Sultan began with the Dawla of Bani Ubayd, the so-called Fatimiyin, and this is a wrong or incorrect attribution. Al-Mu'izz al-Ubaydi, the Ismaili Rafidi, was the first to start this practice in Egypt and forced the Muslims to bow to him. And when the Mamalik, who were mostly Ash'a'ira, had control of Egypt after Bani Ayyub, they retained this practice and they would not pardon anyone from it, despite its clear prohibition in Islam. It didn't matter who they were, except if they were the ulama or from the ashraf. And this practice only ceased in 825 Hijri under the Sultan al-Ashraf al-Barasabi, who put a stop to it and replaced it with the kissing of his hand. Before Mansa Musa came to Egypt, the price of gold was no less than 25 dirham for a mithqat, which was a measure of gold at the time. The amount of gold that Mansa Musa gave in charity and as gifts in Egypt brought the value of gold down by 2 dirhams according to many sources. And that depreciation in value lasted for at least 12 years according to al-Umari. Mansa Musa's generosity and kindness was known even in the Hajj, when he gave much of his wealth or much wealth to the Hujjaj, the people who were making Hajj, and the people around the Haramain, meaning a reference to the masjid in Mecca and the masjid in the prophetic city of Medina. We should know that Mansa Musa was not a philanthropist, but his sadaqah was for the religion, as he believed this was to apply the act of giving charity for the sake of Allah alone and not for the praise of people. Ibn Battuta recounts a story from Mudrik Ibn Faqus that a man came from Tilmisan, known as Ibn Sheikh al-Laban. And he was good to Mansa Musa when he was a young child and gave him 7 1/3 mithqal of gold. When he got older, he consulted with his advisors asking, what is the reward for someone who does this? And they responded, a good deed is rewarded tenfold, so give him 70 mithqal of gold. Instead, Mansa Musa gave him 700 mithqal of gold as well as other gifts. Ibn Battuta said he also heard the story from the son of the Sheikh Ibn al-Laban. When he arrived in Mecca, he intervened in a dispute between some of his people and a group of Turks. He demanded that no fighting or arguing occur during the Hajj. He spent 3 months in Mecca after the Hajj. Mansa Musa was first and foremost concerned with the state of the religion in his lands and amongst his people. He established the Sharia and instituted the study of the Maliki madhab. Every place he traveled to, he funded the building of a Jami' masjid, meaning a masjid that was large enough to hold the people for the Jum'ah congregation as well as the other 5 congregational prayers. He spent a lot of his wealth purchasing books in fiqh and other Islamic sciences. He brought those books back with him on his return so that people can learn the religion of Islam correctly, and they would study the fiqh of Imam Malik and establish the Maliki madhab in their land. Timbuktu had become a place known for the dissemination of Islamic knowledge, specifically in the works of the Malikiyah, and it was common for the ulama to complete a reading of Ash-Shifa of al-Qadi Iyad every Ramadan in Masjid Sunkare and other masajid. He established a university in Timbuktu and ordered the construction of the Jinjibar Masjid, which he paid Abu Ishaq al-Sahili tens of thousands of mithqals of gold to design and build. The masjid still stands today. In the later years, Maliki books like Mukhtasar al-Khalil, al-Risala of Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani would become widely popular and found in many of the households of the surrounding area. Even now, many manuscripts are still found in households. That is, those manuscripts that were not looted by the French or smuggled out of the country. After Mansa Musa, the empire of Mali saw a decline under the rule of his brother Suleiman. The mismanagement of the economy and instability in the various regions weakened the kingdom. In addition to this, word had spread of this immense wealth in the lands of West Africa. Ibn Battuta heard about it and was disappointed in the amount he was given by Mansa Suleiman ibn Abi Bakr. He complained about the stinginess of Mansa Suleiman and then went on to praise Mansa Musa's kindness in giving. Meanwhile, word quickly spread in the Christian communities from the remnants of the Crusaders in the East, and it was not long Or it was not long before stories started being told of untold riches in a land unknown to the Christian empires of Europe. Exaggerations, like the gold throne drawn up by the Majorcan cartographers, increased the desire to start exploring Africa. Mansa Musa had struggled to keep the cultural practices that opposed Islamic beliefs from being mixed into the society. Therefore, Sufism began to spread throughout West Africa and lasted until this day. Many Sufi turuqat or tariqas or paths in West Africa still practice the prostration at the feet of their shuyukh. How far they've come from Mansa Musa's declaration to Sultan Muhammad ibn Qalawun, I am of the Maliki madhab. I do not prostrate to anything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inshallah, we hope that this video has given you insight into the life and background of Mansa Musa rahimahullah ta'ala, one of the richest people in history that we know of. But more important than his wealth was his concern for Islam and establishing the correct beliefs and practices among his people as best as he was able to. We should recognize him more for his contribution to the establishment of Timbuktu as a center of Islamic knowledge rather than just his wealth and charitable giving for the sake of Allah. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel so that you can be notified of new videos. Walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een.